She is a lengthy one, no doubt. It's got the long box, the crew cab. You lose minimal heat energy as well as minimal pumping energy, and so a lot more of that energy is transferred directly into mechanical energy to turn that turbo and give you more power. So I really like why Ford did this. It makes complete sense. Well, we got another snowy morning here, and what do we have in the driveway? Well, we have a 2022 F250 Super Duty with the legendary 6.7 Powerstroke, and I cannot wait to get into here and show you guys what I think about this 6.7 Powerstroke as a licensed diesel mechanic. So let's get into her. Thank you, sir. Well, we made her to the shop. The weather is not the kindest out there, but yes, this is the well, this is the truck right here. She is a lengthy one, no doubt. It's got the long box, the crew cab. It's really just a work truck, but it does have the 6.7 Powerstroke, which is what I wanted. It's still not a bad looking truck for being basically like a, I don't know what they call it, a tradesman trim or whatever. Yeah, I mean, you got the PowerStroke dual exhaust there, always a key feature of the PowerStrokes. I mean, the one thing that always looks weird on these things is the massive chin splitter, but I guess I get it. If it's just a work truck, you might as well get that fuel economy. If it was my personal truck, I'd take that thing right off. I don't care how much fuel economy it saves. But yeah, we'll let this thing drip off here. I'm gonna finish my coffee, and then we'll pop the hood right there and get down to some business. So I've given reviews on the 6.7 Cummins, the 6.6 Duramax. So I figured it was time for me to get my hands on the 6.7 Powerstroke, see what it's all about, and that's exactly what we're gonna do today. We're gonna firstly go over just the specs of the engine, what it's all about, maybe go over some things I like about it, and then obviously go over some issues, and then finally give you guys my conclusion of what I think about this 6.7 Powerstroke as a licensed diesel mechanic. Wow. So right off the bat, the 6.7 Powerstroke debuted in 2011. It replaced the 6.4 Powerstroke, which was really not the best built engine, nor was its predecessor, the 6.0 Powerstroke. In fact, in my opinion, the 6.0 was probably better used as a boat anchor than an actual engine. And so this is the first in-house Ford-built PowerStroke engine. Now, I say this because before that, Ford had a very strong relationship and built engines in coordination with International, and specifically the Navistar division. In fact, they made the legendary 7.3 Powerstroke, which ran from 1994 to 2004, but because of the 6.0 as well as the 6.4 issues, Ford decided to cut ties with International and build an engine completely on their own. And so far, it seems like it was a great decision. After Ford cut ties with Navistar, it seems like the International Navistar engines continued to have their downfall, and they just were not very reliable engines. Whereas the 6.7 Powerstroke was really impressing people with its power, durability, reliability, fuel economy, as well as actually longevity. So it seems like it was a really good decision by Ford to actually invest a lot of research and development into making their own engine, and it seems like it's paying off some dividends. So since 2011, there have been 3 generations of Powerstrokes. In 2015, they kind of tweaked the engine a little bit, revamped it a little bit, gave it more power. And then in 2020, they really boosted the numbers. They gave this thing some monstrous power numbers. This engine right here is sitting at 475 horsepower as well as 1,050 pound-feet of torque, which is a little bit wild. And I can say firsthand that this truck is actually really fast. It's the fastest truck I've ever driven, and I believe the 0 to 60 time on a normal length F250 is like 6.1 seconds. So it is really quick. And what's even more shocking is in 2023, this year, they are going to be releasing a high output version of this 6.7 Powerstroke, which is going to have 500 horsepower and 1,200 pound-feet of torque, which is going to be something to see. That thing is going to be quick and have tons of power. So this engine is very powerful. So today I'm going to focus on the 2020 plus 6.7 Powerstrokes, just because, well, we have the truck right here. So let's go over what changed in 2020 to give this engine that much power. So one of the two big changes in 2020 with the 6.7 Powerstroke is Ford changed the pistons in this engine. Originally, they were aluminum alloy pistons, which is pretty standard across this whole segment, but Ford went with steel pistons in this engine. Now, there's a couple benefits of going with steel pistons. Number one, obviously, is strength. Number two is the heat resistance that steel has over aluminum. And finally, number three is the fact that steel does not expand as much as aluminum does when it gets hot. So you can actually make the tolerances in the cylinder bore much tighter than you could with an aluminum alloy piston. So that is one of the reasons why Ford was able to get so much more power out of this engine. Now, the biggest downside of steel versus aluminum is obviously weight. Steel weighs a lot more than aluminum, but Ford, being smart, what they did is they actually shrunk the piston down. So the piston is actually a very short piston, it's very thin. And they understood that steel, yes, it is very heavy, but it's also very strong. So you don't need as much of it versus aluminum. So they got away with having much less steel, but still having a steel piston. And the end result is that the piston actually weighs pretty much the exact same as an aluminum piston. It's a little bit heavier, but it's really close. So very smart from Ford for doing that. The other benefit, I guess the fourth benefit, if you will, is the fact that since the piston has shrunk down so much, there is a lot less friction between the piston and the cylinder wall. And this is just going to allow a lot more energy to be transferred into mechanical force versus heat friction energy loss in a normal aluminum piston. So again, another way that Ford is able to make that much power out of this engine. Now, the second big change for 2020 is the fueling system, or the fueling system was revised. This truck right here has a fuel system that can get up to 36,000 PSI. That's a 6,000 PSI increase over the 2019 engines. So it is a fair bit of pressure. And because of that added injection pressure, it just means the diesel fuel is going to be atomized that much more efficiently. It means a more clean burn, which adds more power as well as reduced emissions. So it's kind of a win-win situation. In 2020, Ford also revised their VGT turbo. They went with a Honeywell fully electric VGT turbo, whereas before, from 2015 to 2019, it was an electric over hydraulic VGT turbo. And what would happen is if the engine was cold or if the climate was cold, since it was hydraulically actuated, it would be a little bit slow in those colder temperatures. Now with a fully electric VGT, it's really going to minimize any lag whatsoever, and it's just going to be a much more efficient power producing unit. Now finally, in 2020, Ford added some strength to the engine. They actually added strength to the block. They revised and added strength to the heads themselves, as well as adding strength to the connecting rods because of the different pistons. They needed to go with a different connecting rod anyways, but this connecting rod is beefier than the previous one. So quite a bit done in 2020, and that is why this engine can produce that much more power than the previous generations of 6.7s. So there are 5 things that I really like about this V8 diesel Powerstroke, and the number one thing is the fact that it is an under-square engine. Now, what that means is the fact that the stroke is actually larger than the bore of the cylinder. Now, I like that a lot for diesels because under-square engines just naturally make torque very easily and very well because of the long crank throw, and it just gives the engine a mechanical advantage, and therefore it makes torque very easily. Now, almost every V8 engine comes with what's called an over-square engine, meaning that the bore is actually larger than the stroke of the piston, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's actually really good for high revving engines because those engines tend to have a lot less mass on their rotating assembly, which means those engines can rev very quickly and rev very high. So there is a time and a place for them. There's nothing wrong with it, but in terms of a diesel engine that's meant to be pulling and produce a lot of torque, an over square engine is just not really what you're looking for. So it's really, really cool that Ford actually put an under square engine in here. Now, Duramax, they have an over square engine and they seem to produce torque just fine, but with an under square engine, it just makes it so much easier. So that's one thing that actually surprised me, and that's one thing I really like about this engine here. So the second thing that I really like what Ford did with this engine, and it's also very unique to this V8, is the fact that they reversed the flow of air into this engine. So what I mean by that is normally on a typical V8, your intake comes from the inside of the bank. So the intake kind of comes here and here. Now with this engine, they've reversed that. So actually your exhaust comes out into the center of the engine, and the intake actually comes in from the outside of the banks. Obviously, because you have one bank here, one bank there, V8, right? So you have your intake on this side and your exhaust comes into the actual center of the engine. Now there's a couple reasons why Ford did this. So with a V8 engine that is just naturally aspirated, it makes complete sense to have your intakes on the inside as well as your exhaust on the outside, just for ease of piping. Now, when you put a turbo on here, it makes things a little bit more difficult because if your exhaust is on the outside, you have to kind of wrap it back around. Usually the turbo sits in the center of the banks on most engines, so you kind of have to wrap that exhaust around, and it makes for a lot of intricate piping like we see in the Duramax. Now, with this setup, the turbo is still dead center, smack between the two banks, but because the exhaust comes out through the inner side of the bank, the exhaust doesn't really have to be piped around the engine. It goes right into the turbo. So with that, there's a lot of thermal efficiency saved, as well as what's called pumping loss. On, let's say, the Duramax, that exhaust gas has to come out and around, back up to the turbo, and you lose some energy as well as some heat energy there. With this setup, you lose minimal heat energy as well as minimal pumping energy, and so a lot more of that energy is transferred directly into mechanical energy to turn that turbo and give you more power. So I really like why Ford did this. It makes complete sense, and it's awesome to see. The third thing I really like about this PowerStroke is the strength of the engine. Now, I'll be the first one to admit I'm not necessarily a Ford guy. I like Chevy, I obviously like Rams, so I really didn't pay too much attention to this engine, and when I was digging into it for this video, I found it very interesting how much strength Ford actually put into this engine. So first off, like I mentioned earlier, in 2020 they strengthened the block, and the block is a composite graphite iron style block, very strong, and it's also a deep skirted block. Again, tons of strength there. The crankshaft is a forged crankshaft. Now, what holds that forged crankshaft in place is a cross bolt design main cap that has 6 bolts, and that's a lot of bolts. To put that in perspective, the Duramax only uses 4 bolts and the Cummins uses 2. Now that can be a little deceptive because even these big 15-liter engines, they only use 2 bolts per main cap. So I guess it depends how big the bolt is, but it is interesting. It just kind of shows how serious Ford is in terms of, really adding that bottom end strength by using 6 bolts. The main bearing caps are fractured caps, which I talked about a little bit with the Duramax. It is the strongest style of main journal cap you can even get. So again, Ford is serious with that bottom end strength. And then lastly, in terms of the head bolts, so Ford employs 6 head bolts per cylinder, which again is the most out of the Duramax and the Cummins. So the fact that Ford uses 2 more head bolts per cylinder just goes to show that this engine can take a lot of stress. It's going to be able to take a lot of abuse, which is what I think the customers as well as Ford really wanted to do with this engine. The fourth thing I really like about this PowerStroke is a smaller one, but I think really important. It is the fact that when this engine is idling, it'll actually bump itself up to 1,000 RPM, kind of like a high idle. And this does 2 things. So first of all, With any modern diesel, you're gonna have an after treatment system, and when you're idling, it just creates a lot of soot, and engines that idle a lot of the time are just gonna have issues with their after treatment system. Now, if you put the truck at what's called high idle, it will limit the amount of soot going into your after treatment system and just give you more longevity on the truck. So I like that. The second reason why you want some high idle is because of what's called like turbo slobber. Again, engines that idle a lot, they just tend to pass a lot of oil through their turbo. If you put the truck up into high idle, it will limit that once again. I feel like a lot of manufacturers are gonna start employing this because it does make a difference. All the big trucks here, they all have just a high idle switch in the dash. I was always shocked why the pickup truck diesels never just had a high idle switch. I think it's really helpful. Now, the fifth thing that I really like about this engine is the valve train. So the previous generation of engine, the 6.4 Powerstroke, it had a lot of valve train issues, specifically with the rocker arm fulcrum would just tend to wear and just, it would cause a lot of issues. So what Ford did with the 6.7 is they completely redesigned the valve train. So every single valve has its own rocker arm as well as its own push rod. Now, despite this system being very complex, it has actually proved to be extremely reliable. So those are some things I really like about the 6.7 Powerstroke. But it is that time. We need to talk about some known issues about the Powerstroke, and I'll talk about some things that I just don't like about it either. So let's dive into that. So the number one issue and my biggest beef with this engine right now is the Bosch CP4 fuel pump that Ford runs with this engine. It is just not a very reliable pump, and when it does fail, it takes out the whole fueling system, which can run you anywhere from like $10,000 to $15,000 in repair. It's a big job and it's a big problem. Now, granted, Ford has not had as many Bosch CP4 fuel pump failures as, let's say, GM or Ram, but still, it boggles my mind that, you know, Ford obviously can see what's happening with the competition, and when GM went with the CP4, and I believe in 2011 with their LML Duramax, that was a complete nightmare. I think they ran it for like 6 years or 5 years, and there's still class action lawsuits against GM for that fuel pump. Obviously, we saw with Ram, they implemented the CP4 in 2020 as well as 2021. And they were a little bit smarter than GM and you know, discontinued it after only 2 years, going back to the CP3 pump. It kind of boggles my mind that Ford still sticks with it, even knowing what they know today, you know, a decade later. The one argument I've heard is that Ford has a factory lift pump about 55 PSI, and apparently that really helps the CP4 pumps, which I can believe because, as I mentioned, there just hasn't been as many failures as, let's say, GM or Ram, but it would make me very, very uneasy driving a truck with a CP4 fuel pump, knowing what we know today. Now, the best thing you guys can probably do to try and avoid having a CP4 fuel pump issue or failure is to use high quality diesel fuel. So these fuel systems are extremely complex and they run at very, very tight tolerances. And even the slightest amount of debris or water can cause havoc to these things. So fueling up at your backwoods fuel station just really isn't the best idea. I would want to be fueling up at a well-known, newer fuel station that has a lot of diesel volume getting sold every day. That way you know the diesel in the tanks is usually going to be fresh diesel, and it's not just going to be sitting there collecting all bunch of crap and water and condensation. So that would be my number one tip. The second one is to change your fuel filters when you do an oil change. As a diesel mechanic, any truck that comes in and we drop the oil, we change the fuel filters. It's just automatic. And so you guys should be changing your fuel filters every time you do an oil change on these trucks. Yes, it's gonna be a little bit costly, but trust me, it is gonna save you in the end because you have your water fuel separator. Again, any water gets past that into the fuel system, not good. So that would be my two strong recommendations to really help extend the life of, first of all, your engine as well as your fuel pump in these 6.7 Powerstrokes. Another common issue with these Powerstrokes is a clogged EGR cooler. Now, in Ford's defense, this really isn't that uncommon with any modern diesel running an emission system. There's just so much soot that runs through that EGR cooler that from time to time, doesn't matter if it's a Cummins, if it's a Duramax, if it's a Detroit diesel, you know, they do get clogged from time to time, but it does seem like Ford's EGR cooler does get clogged a little bit more consistently. So that is something to look out for, but apparently they are quite easy to replace as well as being pretty inexpensive. So it's not the worst repair if you were to have an EGR cooler clog up on you. Another common issue, once again, dealing with after treatment systems is the EGR sensors, specifically EGR temperature sensors. Now, there's 4 of them on there and each one can fail, but it seems like the middle 2 tend to fail pretty consistently. Now, like the EGR cooler, it does seem like it's a pretty easy fix as well as being pretty cheap. I think a sensor will run you like 50 bucks. So if you do need to replace 2 of them, 100 bucks, it's not the end of the world. So lastly, in terms of issues, I want to just briefly talk about the first generation PowerStroke. So 2011 to 2014. These trucks had quite a bit more issues than what we see today with the newer 6.7 PowerStrokes. The biggest one was turbo problems. They had major turbo failures. The turbo bearings, for whatever reason, would fail. Some people say it's because the turbo itself was just too small for the application, and I can believe that to be true. Another common issue with those early trucks was having leaking rads. For whatever reason, it seemed like the primary radiator would just break or leak. So again, that's just another headache there. The NOx sensors tended to fail on those earlier model of PowerStrokes for whatever reason. And then finally, there was even stories of glow plugs dropping into the cylinder and just taking out engines completely. But again, luckily, those issues have kind of stayed with the earlier model of PowerStrokes. The newer ones don't seem to have any of those issues that I just mentioned, so that's a good thing. All right, so those are my thoughts on the PowerStroke engine here behind me. I guess it's time for the old conclusion. I was actually pleasantly surprised going over and looking into this 6.7 PowerStroke. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm just not really a Ford guy, so I never really took the time to really look into these engines. I'd heard, you know, rumblings that the 6.7 was actually a really good engine, but I also knew about the 6.0 and the 6.4 PowerStroke, which I heard just horror stories about. So it's nice to know that Ford actually took some care in making this engine, and it does seem like a very strong, solid power plant. And with over a decade of real world experience, it does seem like these engines do get good longevity as well, which is never a bad thing. Would I buy this engine over a Ram 2500 with a Cummins in it, because that just seems to be my baby? No, I wouldn't. And that is because one reason, the CP4 fuel pump. You know, you pay a lot of money for these trucks. Any decent truck is probably about $100,000 here in Canada. And, you know, to have a fuel pump that is known to have extraneous issues, and that would be the reason why I wouldn't touch the 6.7 PowerStroke. But that is just my opinion. If Ford was to replace the CP4 fuel pump with another reliable pump, or even go back to a CP3 fuel pump from Bosch, that would be a very hard decision, because I really like what Ford has done. Now, finally, my advice for anyone looking for a used PowerStroke, I would try and stay above the years 2015. Worst case scenario, maybe above 2013. It seemed like the 2011 and the 2012 6.7 PowerStrokes were the ones that were the most riddled with issues. Anyways, guys, as always, if you liked the video, don't forget to leave that thumbs up. And if you like cool stuff like this, don't forget to subscribe. And I got lots of cool stuff planned, so we'd love to have you guys on board. Anyways, enough of me. We'll see you in the next freaking video.